Welcome to week 3 of Mpai 600 here at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies Applied Intelligence Program. Just want to, again, go over right into what we covered last week. Two parts to last week. The first, we talked about requirements, which are driving the collection strategy that you are either finishing up or have completed already. So we talked about requirements, how they're integrated into a collection plan, and how they need to be focused, they need to be tight, falsible, and they need to actually drive the intelligence scenarios. So that was kind of the last part for the collection plan, and with the knowing of the ain'ts and the other issues we brought about in week 1, you should have more than enough to at least put pen to paper for the collection strategy, and you should be complete of it, or almost complete of it, by the time you're watching this video. So we had that, and then the second portion were intelligence traps, analytical failures, and a lot of them were, I'm not going to rehash all of them, but some of the key ones: confirmation bias. You saw that in the confessions video. You saw it in some of the case studies that the tradecraft primer alluded to, whether it's Iraq WMD or 9/11 or Yom Kippur War, and we're going to go in depth into those case studies in future weeks. So confirmation bias occurs, again, where you have an idea, where the first person in the room says something, and all the evidence that's incoming is wrapped around to fit your original hypothesis. That is a trap that we all fall into constantly. There's a reason why we go into our own political wings, and we try, and any new information is wrapped around whatever our original thoughts are. And mirror imaging, we see this constantly. I think we're seeing this now in the North Korea case study, or North Korea going on right now, where we want them to denuclearize. They don't see it that way, and we think, well, they can give up their nuclear weapons like Libya did and other countries, but their mindset is completely different than any of those other countries out there. Unfortunately, we're doing mirror imaging. I think we're doing mirror imaging on Iran, where we assume that certain actions that we're going to do is going to impact them, because we wouldn't have that like that on us. So mirror imaging happens at the highest levels. It happens at the lowest levels as well, and we're going to see that case come up over and over and again when we talk about Yom Kippur War or Iraq WMD. And then the case study, the confessions. As I mentioned, please bring this stuff up in your discussion boards. I need to know that you watch at least watch the case study, and then you can apply what you learned to a real life case. And again, classic confirmation bias, and this is probably, maybe this isn't the best case, because it got to ridiculous levels of confirmation bias, particularly when you were talking about the new DNA evidence that was introduced, and it was a totally different killer that was involved, and how they tried to connect the killer with the original Norfolk 4 in a bizarre case. So this was confirmation bias taken to the extreme. In most cases, you will have confirmation bias, but it won't be on the level that you see that you just saw in this case study. Vividness bias. There was something about the confessions that were played in court on the tape that probably swung the juries and the appellate courts and others that were involved in this case. A confession, and Detective Ford understood this, a confession plays well to a jury. Even though that confession was false, even though there's a lot of evidence to show that people confess to things that they didn't do, that's going to mean a hell of a lot more than DNA or motive or any of the other more classical investigative techniques used to convict people. And again, I think that it was pretty obvious. The jury fell for it. Vividness bias in courtrooms. If I were to show a graphic murder scene to a jury, they are more likely to convict the person that's on trial, even though there is no evidence pointing that that graphic murder scene is connected to the person on trial. But that's a classic vividness bias that we associate, instead of using evidence and analytical thought, we associate these stories or these visuals and cause us to convict people that are innocent. Clientelism. You'll see this in their ACT-WMD case study, but there was pressure on not just Detective Ford, but on the Virginia Beach Police, on the prosecutor's office to arrest somebody, unravel this horrible crime. So, because we think there's a predator in our myths, and there was an enormous amount of pressure, and I think that led to, or that was at least a factor in the false convictions or the false arrests and ultimately false convictions here. You'll see clientelism in the Iraq-WMD case study. You'll see it in the 9/11 case study, where you are trying to please somebody and you are ignoring evidence. That's essentially what clientelism is, and that's especially pronounced in cases of intelligence because you don't know the answer. The answer is not clear, so you can pick and choose pieces of evidence you want to support your boss or your client or whoever you're trying to impress. And then the Georgetown Values. As was mentioned, someone put on the discussion board, this case was not resolved until very recently, 6 months ago, where the final, the convictions weren't vacated. You know, the people were released at the end of the documentary in 2009. Convictions weren't vacated until 2016. The convictions were not vacated. So that means those guys were still on the predator list until then. And the lawsuits weren't finalized until 6 months ago. So 20 plus years later, or almost 20 years later, only finally was justice arrived for these four men. And again, I don't know if, Georgetown's a Jesuit school. I don't know if that people care about this stuff. I don't know if people use religion as a guiding ethical principle. But regardless of religion, I think there's an element of social justice, that we're trying to impart on people in this program and in other programs as well. And this is a classic case study. People were in position to right this wrong, whether it was the detectives at the lowest level, the juries, the judges, the appellate judges, all the way up to the governor, and no one did anything until quite recently. So that's kind of a values case study here that's part of Georgetown's ethical viewpoints. And then finally, I had a student bring this up last semester, and I think it's worthy of saying this, that good people suffer bias. Evil people convict in this case for the confessions. And then Detective Ford did not have bias. He had evil intent. Bias is something we all have, normal people have, good people have, and we can make bad decisions based on those biases. But this was beyond that this was an evil action. I don't know. I don't know what to say to that. I'll be honest, I'm a little bit of a pessimist. I think in certain situations, we could all be Detective Fords. We could all do things that are our moral compass goes awry, and we're doing this for clientelism or other reasons. So we all, we're all capable of that evil, if you want to say that. And then it wasn't just Detective Ford. It was the original detectives. It was the judges, the appellate court, the juries, the governor, all made either biased remarks or biased decisions or just wrong decisions. I don't know. I'll let you decide whether it's just evil or bias that led to this. And then you could argue, was Iraq WMD, was it evil intent or was it just biased analysis? That's a decision for you to make. So week 3 preview. We're going into our history lessons here. So 2 case studies, strategic surprise Yom Kippur War, or Pearl Harbor and Yom Kippur War. And as you're going through the readings and going through the documentaries, you're going to ask where were the failures along the board? Why did the sophisticated American and Israeli intelligence systems fail in these two case studies? And when you're going through the failures, we go along the intelligence collection cycle. Where were the failures in collection? Were the failures in analysis? Did the failures occur where there was policy interference, where the intelligence was disseminating this to policymakers or military leaders, and they didn't disseminate it well? Did the policymakers fail to act, and they had all the information correctly? Were there underlying circumstances? Were just accidents of history that led to these intelligence failures? Were there biases? Were there other or analytical traps that we just explored last week? Were they prevalent in these two case studies? So there's no right or wrong answer. There was failures all along this chain, but I want you to start thinking about where the failure was, where along the line what it was for these two case studies. And then the readings and documentaries, Dal, Intelligence and Surprise Attack. The Yom Kippur War, I had to change the readings out. I'm going to put that in the module. I couldn't find the Avi Shalom, so we're going to do the Riddell article, which I think is actually a little bit better. That talks about the Yom Kippur War. And then the documentary Al Jazeera, The Crossing. It's actually a 3-part documentary. I'm really only signing part 1. And in part 1, really the first 20-25 minutes are dedicated to the intelligence failure relating to the Yom Kippur War. So focus your efforts on that. So yeah, that's the readings and documentaries for this week. And if there's questions or issues, let me know.